Hi there, girls. We're going to look at chapter 20 in the Theme 1 booklet, which is Markets, Consumers and Firms. And this is basically the relationship between revenue and costs. So one of the things that we need to do is just have a think about and try and remember some of the terms that are mentioned on this first slide. So what's meant by fixed costs, variable costs, total costs, and also revenue. And can you or could you draw a line to represent each of these terms on a graph and show the way in which fixed costs relate to variable costs, etc.? We have done a little bit on that, but we'll go through that in a bit more detail and also look at some specific things like break-even and break-even analysis and how you can use that in business and economics. So that's the plan for this particular presentation. Okay, so let's take a look then. There is obviously a relationship between revenue and costs, and it's something we've been talking about really from the start of the course. But we're going to run through this in a little bit of detail and then show the way in which you can calculate, given certain pieces of information, what revenue you've achieved, what costs you've got, and the difference between the two in terms of profit, and where you can break even, which is the point at which total costs and total revenue are the same. So, some concepts that you're going to need to understand. One is a contribution, and basically the contribution is the difference between the selling price of an item and the variable cost of producing that item. So contribution per unit is basically selling price per unit, take away the variable cost of producing that unit. We're also going to look at break-even. So break-even analysis is something that's used quite extensively in business and is also used to plan and demonstrate to potential investors where you believe you need to be in terms of the amount of sales that you need to achieve in order to start to break even and then start to make a profit. So to calculate your break-even point, basically you need to take or be able to calculate your total fixed costs and your total variable costs for producing the items that you're planning to sell, and the point at which your total sales revenue, which essentially is your selling price times the quantity sold, the point at which your total sales revenue is the same as your total costs, that is your break-even point. And that clearly is quite an important point for any business, because if you can manage to get to that point and then sell some more, you basically are starting to make a profit. We can use the contribution, calculating the contribution, to help calculate the break-even point. And in fact, there are two ways in which you can calculate break-even. One, you can use a formula based on using a range of numbers, but you can also draw it graphically. In the first instance, we're going to show, in this case, how you can use the formula, but we will at a later stage look also at drawing a break-even chart to demonstrate how you can do that graphically too. We're also going to look at the margin of safety, which basically is the difference between the number of units that you need to produce and need to sell in order to achieve break-even, and the margin of safety is the difference between the actual amount of output that you're producing and selling as opposed to the break-even number of units, and that's something again that we'll look at together. We're also going to look at some of the limitations of break-even analysis, because whilst it's quite a useful tool, there are some issues with it, and we need to be aware of those limitations whenever we're considering using break-even analysis. So let's take a look at a little bit more detail at what break-even analysis is all about. I'm just going to move myself so that you can actually see the content of these slides slightly better. So, effectively, and there are a number of different ways in which you can define it, but break-even is the point at which a business is not making a profit or it's not making a loss. So it's just basically breaking even. You can put it in a couple of different ways. One is to say that your total cost will be exactly the same as the total revenue that you've generated, and that's the point at which you have reached break even. Another way of putting it is where total revenue equals total cost. So if you needed to present it as a formula, that would be a way of doing it. So break even equals to where total revenue equals total cost. The break even output is basically the number of items that a business needs to sell in order to reach the point of break even. So it's the number of units sold which becomes your break-even output, i.e. the point at which the revenue that you're generating from that level of output is exactly the same as your total costs for producing that output. Now clearly, if we get to a point where we haven't reached break-even, where basically our total costs are higher than the total revenue that we've generated, then the business is actually operating at a loss. But after reaching break-even, after reaching the point at which total revenue equals total cost, for each additional unit over and above the break-even output that you sell, you are contributing towards making a profit. You are actually in profit, as opposed to being either at break-even or making a loss. As soon as you get to that point, any more additional units that you have sold basically is profit. So let's take a look at this principle of contribution, total contribution and contribution per unit. It's a really important one to get your head around because you can use that for all sorts of things, particularly when you're talking about break-even and how well a business might be doing. So fundamentally, what does the word contribution mean? Well, you might have heard contributions in all sorts of charitable senses and in a number of others. What sort of contribution have you made today to the school, for instance? So when we actually contribute towards something, that clearly, in this case, is about making an effort in some way, making some sort of contribution, some sort of positive benefit that you've provided to, in this case, a business. And if we take a look at every time that a business product is sold or a service is provided, then the money that is generated by that product and the amount of money that is received by the firm for that product is obviously contributing towards a number of things. Okay, first and foremost, that has to contribute. The amount of revenue that you generate has to or should do firstly pay for any variable costs that you may have incurred for that particular unit of output, so raw materials, for instance. Now, clearly, once you've done that, once your selling price is higher than your variable cost per unit, then you can start to make contributions to other types of costs. And obviously, we remember we've got to cover total cost in order to get to the point where we're actually breaking even. So in this instance, once we've covered our variable costs, then any contribution is going to first and foremost go towards covering fixed costs. Once that's happened, if we've got enough contribution to cover all of our fixed costs, and remember that we've already covered our variable cost, then we start to get to a position where a business can start to make a profit. So once we've got enough contributions to cover all of the fixed costs for the business, you remember we've already covered our variable cost, then we start to make a profit for any extra contributions we get over and above those that cover variable and fixed costs per unit. And clearly, each time that we sell an item, if we've actually worked this out properly, we should know what our variable cost per unit is, and then we should really be setting our selling price at something significantly higher than the variable cost per unit, so that we can make a contribution from every item that we sell towards covering our fixed costs. So, in this situation, if we get to the point where we're actually achieving some contribution, we will actually put that towards paying off our fixed costs until they're all paid off. Now, if we then take a look at the next situation, we've got not just total contribution, but we've also got contribution per unit. Now, effectively we can calculate both in quite a straightforward fashion, but then let's take contribution per unit first. So that's basically the difference between our selling price per unit and the variable cost per unit. So it's what's left after we've paid our variable cost for producing a unit. Then hopefully the selling price per unit was going to be higher than that variable cost, and then so the contribution per unit is going to be the difference between our selling price per unit and the variable cost per unit. Clearly, the first thing that we need is for our contribution per unit to cover fixed costs and contribute towards fixed costs, and then secondly to profit. Now clearly, if our total contribution doesn't cover our total fixed costs, then we're not going to get into a profit scenario for any business. Remember, just to recap, contribution is basically selling price per unit take away variable cost per unit. So if we get to a scenario, and let's look at a scenario, it's probably the easiest way to do it, where we're selling t-shirts. Okay, we're selling them for £11.50. Each one of them has cost £4 to make, and then from each of those I've got a contribution of £7.50. So my selling price is £11.50. My variable cost per unit is £4. And so in this situation, we've created a contribution per unit of £7.50. Now, if we wanted to calculate our total contribution, we'd need to take that £7.50 and times it by however many units we've sold, and that would give us our total contribution. Okay, that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is to say, let's take our total sales revenue and take away our total variable cost, and we can, in some cases, we can calculate that. So, for instance, in this scenario, if we sell 100 t-shirts, our total sales revenue, based on what we've got above, there is 100, the number of units that we've sold, times by 1150, so that gives us our 1,150 in terms of our total sales revenue, and our total variable cost in this case is £4 per unit, times by 100, so we've got 400 in total as our variable cost. Well, that means that we've essentially created a total contribution based on that set of transactions of £750. Okay, total sales revenue, which is £11.50, take away our total variable cost 400, leaves us with 750 as our total contribution. Now, when we're talking about calculating break-even output, we can use contribution and contribution per unit in order to then calculate our break-even output. And let's take a look at how we can do that. So, first things first, we clearly can use this contribution per unit to help calculate break-even. Essentially, again, just to revisit, contribution is selling price take away variable cost. Okay, contribution per unit is selling price per unit take away variable cost per unit, and total contribution is total revenue take away total variable cost. Now, in order to then calculate our break-even point, and this sort of makes sense if you've been following what we've gone through so far, basically we're going to take our fixed costs and we're going to divide that by our contribution in order to calculate what our break-even point is. Now, in this case, let's just take this step by step. The fixed cost to manufacture the t-shirts is £15,000. We know we've got a contribution per unit based on the £11.50 selling price, take away our £4 of £7.50 per unit. So to calculate how many lots of £7.50 we need to cover our fixed costs, we basically are going to take that 15,000 and divide it by 750. So we've got 15,000 divided by, in this case, our contribution per unit of 750, and that gives us a break-even point of 2,000 units. Okay, so it means that we've got to sell 2,000 units, each giving us a contribution of £7.50 per unit, before we can cover our fixed cost of £15,000. So our break-even output would be 2,000 units, as it says there. So there's a practice question. So you can use some of the information that we just talked through there. Have a go at that practice question. Similar sort of thing. You've got fixed costs at £60,000. You've got variable costs at £650. You've got a selling price of £25.25p. And you've got sales of 4,000 units. Now, the fact that you've got all of that information there, you should be able to calculate from those figures what your contribution per unit is, what your total contribution is, and the break-even level of output by using those formula that we just worked through. Okay, so I'm going to give you some time to have a go at that, complete that, and then we'll move on and take a look at some of the further content. We'll look at margin of safety and one or two other things, and then we shall wind this one up. Okay, so in this case then, let's take a quick look at some figures, and they do relate to some of the figures that we've just been talking about. In this case, to demonstrate how we calculate the break-even output, and remember, this is a point at which we're neither making a profit or a loss. If we've got a scenario like we've got here, okay, so we've got the number of t-shirts, the number that we produce from 0 to 1,000 to 2,000 to 3,000. We know our fixed costs are £15,000, so that's fixed cost, that's cost that doesn't vary with output, so £15,000 irrespective of the number of units that we're producing. Now remember, we know our variable cost per unit was £4, so our variable cost, if we're producing no t-shirts, we've got no variable cost. If we're producing 1,000, with 1,000 times £4 variable cost per unit, that gives us a £4,000 variable cost. At 2,000 units, we've got 8,000 in variable cost. We've got 15,000 fixed cost. And again, that's the same principle, £4 per unit times by the 2,000 units that we're producing. That gives us £8,000 worth of variable cost. If we take 3,000 units, so we're producing 3,000 units, our fixed cost of £15,000 still, we've still got £4 per unit as our variable cost, times by the 3,000 units, that gives us 12,000. And you can see then our total cost is just a case of adding those numbers up together. So 15,000 fixed cost, no variable cost, 15,000. For 1,000 units, we've got £15,000 worth of fixed cost. We've got £4,000 worth of variable cost. The total of those two is 19,000. The revenue that we're achieving, and remember it's £11.50 per item, per our selling price, 1,000 items, so we've achieved £11,500 worth of revenue. Okay, we'll come back to whether it's a profit and loss in a minute. Then we'll take a look at this next one. Now this is the one that you should probably be most focused on, because in this instance we've got £15,000 worth of fixed cost, we've got £8,000 worth of variable cost. We've achieved, in this case, 2,000 units, sold them at £11.50 each, and you can see our total cost is £23,000. And actually, based on our £11.50 selling price, we're achieving £23,000 worth of revenue. So that is the point, 2,000 units, where we're actually breaking even, where our total revenue equals our total cost. Prior to that, and you can see at 0 units produced and 1,000 units produced, we are making a loss. So we've got £15,000 worth of cost, but no revenue. In the second case, where we're selling 1,000 units, we've got £19,000 worth of cost, only £11,500 worth of revenue, so we're actually making a loss of £7,500. When we get to 2,000 units, we have got to break even. So essentially, total cost and total revenue are the same. So we're not making a loss, we're not making a profit. We're actually at the point where total cost equals total revenue, and we're breaking even. Now, as soon as we get into the next level of output, if we're achieving 3,000, if we've got 3,000 that we produced, and we've got, in this case, again, £15,000 worth of fixed cost, we've got £12,000 worth of variable cost. Total costs in this instance, £27,000, but we've achieved total revenue of £34,500. So when we take away our total cost from our total revenue, you can see that at 3,000 units, if we were to sell 3,000 units at the prices that we've just talked about, then we're going to make £7,500 worth of profit. Okay, so two losses at 0 units and 1,000 units. We break even at 2,000 units. Anything over and above 2,000, we achieve profit. And basically at 3,000 units, we make £7,500 worth of profit. Okay, so the next thing to look at then, so that's break even. Another concept within break even is something called the margin of safety. Now, basically, that is the difference between how much actual output we achieve and how much above the break-even level of output that the margin of safety is. Okay, so that might sound a bit convoluted. I'll try and explain it in a slightly different way. Basically, we calculate it by taking the actual output level that we're producing at, and we take away the break-even level of output. So let's assume in this instance, or if we go back and take a look at this scenario here, you can see that in this instance, let's say that our break-even output was 2,000 units. We know it's 2,000 units based on our example. So at 2,000 units, we have got no margin of safety because we've actually broken even. Now let's assume that our actual output was at 3,000 units. Well, the difference, in order to calculate the margin of safety, what you do is take, in this case, our actual number of units of output at 3,000 units, and we take that away from our break-even output, which is 2,000, and effectively our margin of safety would then be 1,000 units. Okay, so the margin of safety between just breaking even and actually making some profit, or from where our actual output is in this case the difference between the two. So that would actually be 1,000 units. Okay, so another example here. Well, it's essentially what I've just described, effectively, isn't it? So that our t-shirt break-even output was 2,000 units. Okay, our assumed actual output is 3,000 units. So we would be producing at a point 1,000 units further on than our break-even point. So our margin of safety would be, in that case, 1,000 t-shirts. Okay, so there are a few issues around break-even, so it's quite a good concept, particularly if you're trying to demonstrate to potential investors the fact that you've been able to calculate your variable costs, your fixed cost, what you think your revenue should be, and also your break-even. So it's showing that you've actually understood or tried to understand what the situation is going to be. Now, the only issue with break-even is that it's quite a theoretical concept, and there are a few things that you need to bear in mind in terms of, number one, the limitations, but also how changing certain variables might cause break-even to change too. So let's have a look at some of those. So I think there's a big caveat to say that when you're using break-even, you should treat it with a degree of caution. Okay, so it's not going to prove anything. It's basically quite a theoretical concept. And it does make some assumptions that do sometimes mean that just by relying on break-even isn't necessarily going to give you the full picture. So it's based on a number of assumptions, like we said, that costs and revenues will be static and they will stay the same for a period of time, and that in reality isn't always true. Clearly, in some cases, businesses are sometimes asked to or considered to advise variables and how they might change, and possibly look at a number of scenarios. So effectively you might do what's known as sensitivity analysis or what if scenarios and say, well, if we said this is the situation, but actually what happens if this change happens, then sometimes we can use different examples of break even using different scenarios and saying, well, in this case, if the worst case happened, this is the way in which we might be able to interpret that information. Clearly, variables can change for better or for worse, and we can think about a number of variables and how they might change. Well, clearly, your supply cost might change, the number of units sold might change. There are a number of different variables that clearly can change, which will have a fundamental effect on your break-even levels. And it's very important to bear that in mind. So fixed costs could change. Your landlord could put your rent up. Bank changes interest rates. That again might affect your fixed costs. If they bring interest rates down, that would reduce your fixed costs. If they increase them, that would actually increase your fixed costs. Management might want a pay increase. All these things will have things that will cause some of our variables to change, and that clearly is something that we would need to consider when trying to calculate break-even situations. Okay. Raw materials might change in price. Minimum wage could increase, so that would affect your variable cost. Utility companies might change their prices. All of these things will cause the variables that you're trying to assess and calculate, and that clearly then has an effect on the level of sales revenue you're going to need to get to achieve break-even. Your selling price could change. New competition enters the market. Now, if that happens and they start undercutting, what are you going to do? Keep your price the same, or are you going to have to cut price too to make sure you maintain market share and leadership position, possibly in a certain scenario? Okay. However, you could find that if you get decent advertising collateral, you might find that word of mouth and reviews start to increase demand, and that clearly means that you might be able to alter your selling price in a positive way. So all of these changing variables do mean that when you come to calculate break even, you maybe need to think about some of those potential changing variables so that you give a realistic view of what might go on. So let's have a look at some of the strengths and weaknesses of break even, and then I think we'll stop. So one of the big strengths is that it allows a business to calculate the minimum number of sales needed before it can start to make a profit, and that allows you as an individual or a business owner to see whether a venture might be feasible or viable rather. And also it might mean that if you've gone through that process and you're looking to try to get investment or get somebody to invest in your business, that you've got a fairly solid case to say, well, these are the calculations we've done. And clearly that obviously is a real strength. The other thing that you can do is you can look at the levels of profit or loss that you're going to achieve at different levels of output. You might even be able to predict the outcomes of changing certain variables. Once you've got your break-even chart in place, you could say, well, actually, if we increased our price, that would reduce our break-even number of units by whatever. So you can give sort of what-if scenarios. You can use it to provide targets for your staff. Okay, you can use it as part of your business planning if you're seeking to secure finance, and it clearly helps to aid decision making. But the view is that it's only one tool, and it's quite a theoretical tool, and you might need to overlay that with other things like asking your potential customers how much they'd be willing to pay for your good or service, whether the selling price is a realistic figure given what the market might be willing to pay. Now, some of the weaknesses of break-even, in some cases, or in most cases, you're going to be basing this on predictions, both predicted costs and revenues. Now, it might well be that if you've really got a decent costing system, you can completely button that down and be fairly accurate. However, it's still going to be based on predictions, not reality. Now, we've mentioned that in the long run, fixed costs can vary in reality, even fixed costs can, but especially in the long run, and especially when we're talking about economics, where effectively the view is that fixed costs over a period of 12 months can change and will vary, and that essentially causes all costs to become variable. Other things in terms of weaknesses, if there are changes in variable costs or selling price, that can sometimes be ignored. It might mean that in that new scenario, you might need to draw up another set of break-even charts in order to compare one situation to another. And clearly, again, it's rather assuming that the number of sales that you need doesn't actually mean that those sales will materialize. It maybe gives you a target that you can use for your business to say, this is what we need to achieve, but it doesn't, just because you draw it on a break-even chart doesn't mean it's going to happen. And there might be some blood, sweat and tears to try to achieve those figures. So it is a useful tool. It's a very useful tool in lots of ways to prove to people that you're serious about your business, and you can use it as a guide and a set of targets for your team to try to aim for. But it does need to be used with a little bit of caution, and probably overlaid with some other pieces of information to make your decision making as accurate as it can be. Okay, so thank you for listening. That just covers those last couple of examples on break-even. And the next thing that we'll be looking at is chapter 21, and that is basically, if I remember rightly, where we're going to start to look at exploring profit and loss. So that moves on pretty nicely from where we just left off, but we'll also look at some profit ratios and interpreting figures and accounts, so we start to get a real feel for the way in which a business starts to manage its finances to a greater extent. So thank you for listening. Hopefully you found that interesting. We will be doing a couple of calculations over the next couple of sessions, just to try and test your understanding as far as break-even is concerned, and also show you the way in which you can use a graph to calculate break-even too.